let's start at the beginning and tell us a little bit about how a writer and a researcher and a DJ, born and raised in the UK, finds himself in the home of the Mthembu family in KwaZulu-Natal to negotiate lobola.
Oh, yeah, that's quite a long story. Well, my wife Linda and I, we met in Zimbabwe in 1989, actually, but lived together in the UK for a few years. And then when we came back to South Africa, it was made clear from the outset that I would have to negotiate and pay lobola. But I took the view that that was an excellent thing, because one of the suspicions of, or concerns of the family, was potentially that I was just going to take Linda away and that would be that. But this was a way of signalling to everyone living and passed on that that wasn't the case, and that I would respect the ways things are supposed to be. So I had a trade unionist as my negotiator, whose opening position was that I should pay no cows at all, because this was an outdated empirical bourgeois conventional, something along those lines. And Lindo's family pitched for quite a significant number of cattle, and we met in the middle somewhere, and that's how it came to be.
What I find interesting, having read this book, one of the first things I thought was, why hadn't someone written this years ago? It seems such an obvious book to write, and yet it hadn't been written. And yet at the same time, because of this very clear link between livestock, land use management and the climate crisis, it couldn't be more timely than it is now. And you use very contemporary language as well, climate collapse, climate breakdown, rather than the older words like climate change. Why did you decide to write this book, and why now?
Well, why now? Yeah, it did take a long time. It took 10 years, which was about 9 or 8 years longer than I anticipated. When I started off, the idea was to write a book about South Africa. I lived in the country for 20 years, and as I describe in the book, actually, we'd gone to this movie called Heaven's Herds, which, if you haven't seen it, is a wonderful movie about Nguni cattle. Very evocative, lovely footage of the horns at dawn and the silhouettes. And beautiful movie. Anyway, we came out of it and we went out into a superette and saw all this stack of polony. And I thought, that's it. That spectrum is a great way to tell a story about South Africa. That other countries would have the Nguni side, but it was that spectrum that I thought was so good. And I started interviewing people who were involved in cattle, in Nguni cattle, in abattoirs, in wholesalers. And I kept just, every time I mentioned that I was doing the book, people would say, oh, I know somebody who got a farm somewhere, or somebody had some cattle connection, and I would just follow those links, and it just got deeper and deeper. But as I was writing over the years and years, the issue of climate breakdown became more and more a stronger and stronger issue, and the voices saying the first thing we should all be doing is quitting meat were getting louder and louder. So I felt I can't just ignore that, even though it wasn't the original intention. So I took a deep breath and plunged into the climate science of it, and came out the other side with a view that's expressed in the book, that there is still a space for cattle, but just not a very big one.
Mm. So one of the things that comes through clearly is that, you know, for many of us who are conditioned by the industrial food system, we tend to just see cattle as cuts of meat on the hoof. They're just protein that need to be turned into profit at various stages along the value chain. But you explore a very different relationship between most South Africans and cattle. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, part of the fieldwork for the book, we went up to northern KwaZulu-Natal and into homesteads of people who still live with cattle in the homestead, and exploring with them what cattle mean for them. And as we went into it, I realised that this was an absolutely vast topic, there was a no end to it, actually. Once you gave people the opportunity to start explaining what are the links between them as the living and cattle and ancestors, it was just an absolute myriad of connections that just ran so deep, from the clothes people wore to the way the houses were arranged to the language they spoke to how it mediated these relationships. And so it gave me this idea of the title about wanted, dead and alive, because in those cultures, in those places I was going to, the value of the cattle is completely in their being living beings who are part of the extended household, whereas in the commercial beef industry, the value comes at the point of death, and the value is in the corpse, and it's a really
and essentially it's a teenage corpse because they're so young.
They're so young. They're 18 months old, the size of 3-year-olds, because of what they've been fed in feedlots. So it's a totally different understanding. Even in dairy, in commercial dairy, people aren't so much farming cattle as farming their udders and their rumen, rather. And then I talk a bit in the book about this embryo flushing and this whole science around it. And you know, people are farming embryos, and the cattle are just vehicles for what is really desired. And the idea of a cow as being something you want in its entirety, alive, was another part of South African understanding of cattle that I wanted to explore.
There's a little section I'd love you to read, because I think it captures so much of what you're saying now, but also how people who are outside of this culture might not get it. Just starting there.
So this is an interview, part of an interview with one of the guys from northern KwaZulu-Natal we're interviewing. I think it was the Gumedes, yes, Mr. Gumede. So I asked him, I just put to him that point of view of often white commercial farmers, that all this cultural stuff is what keeps people like the Gumedes poor. And he thought for a while and replied, "White farmers are entitled to their point of view. They do not understand that our cattle, our living cattle, are part of our homestead. We understand there's money in cattle, but this is not our priority. Our priority is not to sell our cattle. We prefer to live from what we grow in our gardens and the milk from our cows, and only slaughter when the occasion is right. Sometimes we'll sell a cow if there's an urgent need of money, but only with great pain. Cattle are part of our lives. When we die, our bodies are wrapped in a cow's hide, and when we live, we wear their hides, their skins, connecting us to our cattle and to our ancestors. That is how it was, at least. Everything we had came from the world around us." Gumede then asked a young boy to bring his Zulu regalia. When the boy returned, Gumede unhurriedly took off his trousers and shirt and pulled on the items, cheerfully identifying every item of clothing by name and which part of the cow it comes from. After a pause, he continued, "We've compromised enough with you whites. We have really tried. We put on shirts and trousers and lost this connection with our cattle. But this love we have of cattle, we cannot compromise on that. It goes beyond the skins we wear or the meat we eat. Perhaps it will be hard for you to understand, but we're asking that you accept it, this interdependence of ours with cattle."
You travel into the Eastern Cape and visit a farmer, Agri Mahanyana, to look at the question of getting cattle farmers thriving again in South Africa outside of the large sort of white commercial farming sector. Tell us a little bit about what the main challenges are, because cattle, obviously, you need a lot more grazing land to succeed as a farmer. So what did you learn from Agri?
So Agri Mahanyana is the president of NERPO, which is the National Emerging Red Meat Producers Organisation. So he's a kind of black commercial farmer activist. So from his perspective, he got a farm through land reform. It was a farm that had belonged to some 1820 settler family, and they'd run out of people who wanted it at a certain point, and the farm went up on the market, the government bought it and gave it to him. So there he was trying to make a go of it. But one thing he lacked was, and this was his main concern, was cheap credit. That he was saying that it was only going to be in the third generation, if he was take him as the first generation, that this farm was going to be profitable, and he needed access to land, but to credit that just wasn't there. The only loans, it seemed like there's so little money available for the land bank, for reasons I was never fully able to establish. There is money there, but how it gets allocated and what happens to it is another whole subject of research. So he was going to commercial banks, who didn't really want to touch it anyway because farming is such a difficult activity, and having to borrow at commercial rates that he was never going to be able to pay back. So that was one of his big concerns, was about the lack of cheap credit. He'd sort of given up on government. The Eastern Cape administration, when I did the interview, had been through so many different ministers, and the idea of policy or evidence-driven policy had sort of disappeared along the way, and different ministers would just do little pilot projects and symbolic stuff, really. So he'd given up on them. But I think that the really telling thing for me was when I asked him, when he told me that it would take 3 generations for his farm to work. So I asked him, well, what about your children then? Are they keen? He said, oh no, they want to make movies. So after that, I felt like maybe it's a tragic story, and I asked him if he felt it was a tragic story. And he said no, because when he was a little kid growing up in the Eastern Cape, his mother had taught in farm schools, and he'd gone round to these farms, and he dreamed of the day when he could have a farm. And he said, I didn't realise then that actually it was the bank that owned the farms. Now I know that. But he said it's better to be awake than to be dreaming.
What I picked up in Agri's story is this idea that farmers, they need to pick up this kind of intergenerational knowledge. They need the networks, they need the kind of culture that surrounds farming, and that you almost have to be born into and raised in that community. Given how much our sort of migrant labour system and land disposition has disrupted families and interrupted that parent-to-child knowledge exchange, is this something we can ever recover?
It's a massive loss. As I went into it, you can see, and through reading about it, I saw that families can have farming knowledge that goes back generations. And if you break it 1 generation, it's sort of recoverable. But if it breaks over 2, it's almost like it never happened. And it's a massive challenge for people to, they try and, you have these mentorship schemes, but then that goes into the question of, well, what kind of farming are we trying to create? Also in Namibia, they've tried mentorship schemes where commercial farmers try and mentor so-called emerging farmers to become commercial farmers. But it's almost like we've got too few categories. We've got communal farmers and we've got commercial farmers, and there's not much in the middle. And it's the middle that we've really got to look at.
Let's talk about Nguni cattle. Are they the mongrel breed that some commercial farmers think? Or, tell us a little bit about Ngunis.
So in town we all love Ngunis because they've got beautiful hides, and they are drought. They seem very hardy. The commercial, the feedlots don't want them because they don't get fat if you feed them with maize. Well, all cows get sick if you feed them with maize, but the cows we eat get fat and sick. So that they go with that. But the Ngunis don't. So they don't like that. They don't produce much milk. So from the in commercial farming paradigm, what's the point? So you find that they're breeded for stud, and there's a whole specialist market for them. But then from a climate breakdown point of view, they are capable of surviving increasingly dry South Africa. They can do it, and and the other really interesting, well, there are many fascinating bits about them, but in terms of the new thinking about trying to re-wild farms, so but allow grazing of livestock as well, so that you'd have a large farm and you'd have a herd of cattle, and you allow back the wildlife, the rewilding of it, which is the best for carbon sequestration and its and all that. But in order for those cattle to survive, they've got to be savvy enough to handle some level of predation from predators. And Ngoonies are alert, intelligent animals that they need some herding to save them from really serious predators, but they're much more capable of looking after themselves than very bred cattle. When cattle are bred, they're bred for something. They're bred for milk or for beef, but they lose bits of their brain in the process. So you get like Holstein cattle, these enormous udders that are so brain dead that they're like cattle zombies that are incapable of looking after their calves. They have to take the calves away from them in case the Holsteins sit on them. They really are zombies. Whereas Ngoonies, which have, because of the interest in the culture of sort of what you get, that the hide tells you something, the horns tell you something, so they've never been selectively bred. So they've emerged as sort of idiosyncratic all-rounders who can browse and graze and handle themselves. So they are the perfect climate crisis cattle. I went to the Curran beef feedlot out in Heidelberg, and there's 120,000 cattle in that one feedlot that there's over 1,000 heads slaughtered a day, and it supplies about a third of the commercial beef output of this country. Now, that's too much. We can't be doing this steak on a Wednesday night thing. We have to reduce. And I get into how the way we consume beef actually needs to draw more on the ways that which people consume these animals in rural areas, where you don't do it very often, and when you do it, you eat the whole thing.
And I guess one thing we're seeing with people moving to cities and this, what they call the nutritional transition, the switch into this sort of more modern urban diet, is that everyone's meat consumption goes up. Do you think it's realistic to hope that there'll be a cultural attitude towards this and people willingly reducing the volume of meat they eat each year?
Probably not. That's when I start feeling apocalyptic about it, because as I was writing the book and seeing how things should go, and then looking at how things are going, it's nearly always the opposite. There's a niche thing around grass-fed beef that's happening, but what's happening for most South Africans is they're trading down quality to maintain volume. So you go to chlorinated chicken or polony. I mean, polony, for all its many sins, does use the bits of the carcass that fastidious eaters don't eat. So it does get eaten, but there are just better ways to eat it than put it in a centrifuge and spraying it with ammonia.
Some cows produce white fat, some produce yellow fat. Explain why that happens and how that has become cemented in our attitudes towards meat because of the grading system.
Yeah, this was something I had no idea about until I started looking at it. That I thought that white fat on beef meant it was fresh, and yellow fat meant that it was a bit old and probably not very nice. And then I learned that the white fat is one of the byproducts of putting cattle through feedlots and feeding them maize. And if you do just leave your cattle on the veldt and they feed on grass, the fat comes out yellow. And this is one of the factors cited by supermarkets for avoiding grass-fed beef, is because they felt that the punters wouldn't like it because they feel they're getting older and tougher meat. I mean, the interaction between the grading system and the feedlot industry is really not understood. But basically, the grading system of meat grades as highest exactly the kind of meat that feedlot produces. So they focus on tenderness and white fat and things like that. And now the tenderness in the feedlot beef comes about from the fact that it's, as I said, an 18-month-old that's the size of a 3-year-old, and it's slaughtered at 18 months. And so it's sort of, of course it's tender, it's a baby. But what it hasn't done is acquire any flavour. You know, it takes 5. It's sometimes in France they slaughter at 7. Then now you've got meat that tastes of something. But then in a culture where you slathering it with monkey gland sauce or something, then flavour doesn't matter too much, because it just becomes a tender vehicle for tomato sauce in the end. And the grading system plays into that by saying, yeah, that's the best beef.
And my understanding is that the yellow fat from an animal that's been grass-fed is actually better for your heart health than an animal that's been feedlot-fed on grain, because of the different ratios of omega-3s to omega-6s. So the grain-fed one is actually not good for your heart health.
Yeah, into the bargain, the white fat's not good for you. And the yellow fat is. So, and when I put this to the supermarkets, they were saying, well, yeah, but you know, we just give the customers what they want. And I was saying, isn't there a case for educating the public on this, or reintroducing that? And they sort of, it was more like, well, someone else can do that.
National Braai Day seems to have latched itself onto a special Heritage Day in South Africa. Tell us a little bit about how that happened, because there still seems to be this perception that braai vleis is something that white sort of Afrikaans-speaking people do. What was National Braai Day all about? How did this happen?
Right, so one of the people I interviewed for the book was Jan Scannell, otherwise known as Jan Braai, who invented National Braai Day. And he used to be in marketing, and I interviewed him. He wanted to have a day. He felt that braaiing was something that all South Africans had in common, and that there's something that unified the country and everyone could get behind it. And he was looking for a public holiday, and the public holiday he picked was Heritage Day. Now, that day used to be Dingaan Day, I think, Shaka Day. And I was asked by Lindway to wearing a Zulu hat, saying, what's he doing? Why did he have to go with the Zulu Day? Why couldn't he have gone with one of the Afrikaner days, you know? Why are one? And so I thought, oh, that's a fair question. So I rang him up and asked him. And he said, oh, well, because the reconciliation day, it falls too late. Once you get past it into October, all the supermarkets can think of is Christmas. So you've got to get in there earlier. And they were prepared to go with National Braai Day because it's September, and they haven't gone to anything. So that was it. That's the reason. So it's a funny mix of reconciliation and marketing. And he, as we know, he ran into a lot of trouble from people saying that he had no right to appropriate a national holiday and turn it into something else. And he's tried to respond to that by, if you ever go look at the National Braai Day website, you'll see it has sort of struggle iconography, and it's got something like one struggle around the braai, or it's something like that. But he's trying to have it both ways. But I did read a commentary on it in that really good website, Africa as a Country, talking about how the idea of the braai as being a unifying thing. He's saying it's a bit like seeing the N1 as a unifying road because we're all on it. But where we're heading off to on the exits is not very unifying at all. So I thought that was a fair critique.
Thank you.
I do want to write a book about Congo, and that so maybe that's the next one. But I do have another South Africa idea in mind, but I'm not going to blow it just yet.
Okay, you can keep that under wraps. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your week.
Thanks.